They said my aunt's entire estate would go to me. Every acre of land, the house she built, even the money she kept hidden away from the rest of the family. And the very same parents who abandoned me 20 years ago stood up and claimed they still had a right to it. I didn't answer, not right away, because the truth is, I had been preparing for this moment all my life, even if I didn't realize it. My name is David Fairchild. I'm 35 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I've carried two truths like stones in my pocket. The first, that my mother, Linda Fairchild, and her husband, Robert Miller, walked away from me when I was 15, leaving me in the care of my aunt. The second, that my aunt, Margaret Fairchild, never once let me feel like I was less than a son. She raised me, guided me, fought for me, and ultimately trusted me with everything she owned when she passed away. That's why I was sitting in that oak-paneled room, at the long, polished table where the reading of her will was taking place. The air was heavy with perfume, old wood, and tension thick enough to choke on. On one side of the table sat my parents, if I can even call them that. I hadn't seen them in 2 decades. Their faces had aged, lined by time, but their eyes still carried that same restless hunger I remembered from my youth. On the other side sat Mr. Harrison Bradford, my aunt's lawyer, calm as ever, with his wire-frame glasses and the leather folder that held my future. He cleared his throat, and in his steady voice he read out Margaret's words. To my beloved nephew, David Fairchild, whom I raised as my own son, I leave my entire estate without exception or condition. The room shifted. I felt eyes burning into me from across the table. Linda gasped and Robert slammed a hand against the wood. "This isn't right," Linda said, her voice trembling but sharp. "I'm her sister. Blood runs deeper than anything written on a page. I deserve my share." Robert leaned forward, his jaw tight. "We're still your family, David. Don't think you can shut us out with some paper trick." Family. The word twisted in my chest like a knife. They had thrown that word away the night they left me behind, 20 years ago, and now they spoke it as though it gave them power over me. I sat in silence, my hands clasped in my lap, not because I didn't have words, but because I knew there were stronger weapons at play than anger. I glanced at Mr. Harrison. He gave the faintest nod, as though he knew what was coming next. Because Margaret had prepared for this. She had known, long before she died, that her sister and her husband would return the moment money was involved. She had told me once, her hand resting lightly on mine, "People who abandon love will always return for wealth. That's why we must guard what really matters." And in that moment, as Linda's voice rose higher and Robert's fists clenched tighter, Mr. Bradford calmly placed another envelope on the table. Per Mrs. Fairchild's instructions, this document is to be read only if the will is contested. The room froze. Linda's eyes darted to Robert's. His face turned pale, then red. "What document?" Robert barked. Mr. Bradford adjusted his glasses, unhurried. "A sealed addendum, written and signed by Margaret Fairchild herself. It contains further instructions regarding her estate and the decision she made about who has and who has not the right to claim it." My heart pounded, but I kept my face still, because in that envelope lay the truth Margaret had always promised would protect me. The truth that would remind everyone in that room why she had chosen me and not them. And as Bradford reached for the seal, Linda leaned forward, her voice breaking into a whisper only I could hear. "David, you wouldn't take everything from your own mother, would you?" Her words should have torn me apart, but instead, they confirmed what I already knew. She hadn't come for reconciliation. She had come for the money. I drew in a slow breath, and then I watched as Bradford tore the envelope open, the sound of ripping paper echoing like thunder in that silent room. Inside was a document that would change the way everyone looked at my parents forever. The seal broke with a crisp sound, and Mr. Bradford unfolded the pages slowly, as though he knew the weight of every word inside. "This," he said, "is a statement signed by Linda Fairchild and Robert Miller 20 years ago." His eyes flicked toward my parents. "A renunciation of guardianship, effective immediately at the time of signing. It granted full custody of David Fairchild to his aunt, Margaret Fairchild." The room went silent. Linda's face drained of color. Robert shifted uncomfortably, his fists clenched tight against the table. And as those words echoed, my mind pulled me backward, back to the night when everything changed. I was 15 years old. The house smelled of lavender that night, though I didn't know if Margaret had put fresh sachets in the drawers or if it was just how her home always smelled, safe, calm, steady. Linda and Robert had driven me there in silence. I sat in the back seat, staring out the window at the blur of passing trees, my heart pounding without understanding why. They hadn't spoken a word to me. When the car stopped, Linda's voice finally broke the silence, cold, efficient. "You'll stay here with your aunt for a while. She has the means to care for you better than we can." I remember looking at Robert, hoping he'd object, hoping he'd say this wasn't permanent. But he didn't look at me. He just signed a paper on the hood of the car while the porch light from Margaret's house spilled over him. Margaret appeared in the doorway, her robe tied tightly around her waist, her face both tired and determined. She took the paper, scanned it, then looked at me with eyes that softened the moment they met mine. "You're safe now, David," she said, pulling me into her arms. I wanted to resist. I wanted to run after the car as it drove away. But deep down, I knew they weren't coming back. The sound of the tires crunching gravel that night was the last sound I heard from my parents for 20 years. Back in the present, I realized my hands were trembling under the table. But I didn't hide them. Let them see. Let them know I remembered. Bradford laid the document flat on the polished wood and pushed it forward so everyone could see the signatures at the bottom. Not only did Margaret assume full legal custody, but this document bars Linda Fairchild and Robert Miller from making any claim on this estate, past or future. They relinquished those rights in writing. Robert shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is a setup," he barked. "I never signed anything like that." Bradford didn't flinch. He simply tapped the embossed notary seal in the corner of the page. "It bears your signature, and it was notarized 20 years ago." Linda reached for the paper, her voice trembling. I was young. We were struggling. We thought it was temporary." Her words felt like knives dulled by time, still sharp enough to cut, but useless against the truth in front of us. For the first time since the reading began, I leaned forward, my voice calm but heavy. "You didn't leave me with her because you were struggling. You left me because it was easier to walk away." Linda's eyes filled with tears. Robert glared at me but said nothing. And then Bradford added, his voice firm and final. "Per this document, any claim Linda Fairchild or Robert Miller attempt to make on this estate is invalid. The law is clear." The silence that followed was suffocating. I could feel their anger, their desperation, pressing against me like a storm. Robert slammed his fist on the table and growled, "This isn't over, David. You think one piece of paper can erase blood?" Robert's words still echoed across the oak-paneled room. "You think one piece of paper can erase blood?" His face was red with rage, his fists trembling against the polished wood. But before I could respond, Mr. Bradford adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "There's more," he said calmly. "Per Mrs. Fairchild's instructions, I am to call a witness." The door at the far end of the room opened, and in stepped a man I had known all my life, Edward Porter. He was older now, his once dark hair streaked with silver, his frame still broad from years of work on his farm next door to Margaret's estate. He carried himself with quiet dignity, the kind that doesn't need to be announced. Linda's eyes widened the moment she saw him. Robert muttered under his breath. Edward removed his hat, held it respectfully at his side, and took a seat across from me. "I was asked by Margaret to speak today," he began, his voice steady but warm. "I lived next door to the Fairchild estate for over 30 years. I watched David grow up in that house, and I can say, without hesitation, that it was Margaret, not Linda, not Robert, who raised him. She fed him, clothed him, educated him. She was his mother in every way that matters." He paused, his eyes landing briefly on Linda. "In fact," he continued, "I can count on one hand the times I saw either of you visit after you left him. And when you did, it wasn't to ask about David, it was to ask Margaret for money." A murmur rippled through the room. Linda's cheeks flushed crimson, and she shook her head violently. "That's not true. Edward, you don't understand." But he cut her off now, his voice firm. "I understand enough. I was there. I saw the letters you sent, Linda. I saw the envelopes Margaret tore open at her kitchen table, the tears she tried to hide when you begged her for money but never once asked how David was doing." The words hit like a hammer. Robert shifted in his chair, glaring at Edward as though he could silence him with his stare. But Edward didn't flinch. He looked only at me. "Your aunt wanted this to be clear, David. She raised you. You were her son, and she knew this day would come." Bradford leaned forward, producing yet another envelope from the leather folder, this one smaller, sealed with red wax. "This," he said, placing it carefully in front of me, "is a personal letter Margaret wrote for you, to be opened only in this room if her will was contested." My throat tightened as I stared at the envelope. The wax glistened under the chandelier's light, the script of her name in neat, deliberate strokes across the front. For a moment, I couldn't move. My hands hovered above it, trembling, the weight of 20 years of love and loss pressing down on me. Across the table, Linda whispered, almost pleading, "David, you don't need to read that, please." But I knew I would. I had to. Because inside that envelope was Margaret's final voice, her final shield for me against the two people who had abandoned me. I broke the wax seal, unfolded the paper, and saw the first line in her unmistakable handwriting. "If they are in the room, it means I was right." The paper felt heavier than it should have. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. The ink slightly faded, but the strokes precise, just as I remembered her handwriting from notes she used to leave on the kitchen counter. I drew a breath and began to read aloud. "If they are in the room, it means I was right." Linda shifted in her seat. Robert muttered something under his breath. I continued. "David, I raised you not out of duty but out of love. You were my son in every way that mattered. And though I tried to protect you from the truth, I always knew this day would come. The day when those who abandoned you would return, not with open arms, but with open hands." My voice cracked, but I pressed on. "I wanted to be clear. They did not lose you because of poverty or misfortune. They lost you because they chose themselves over you. I kept every letter your mother sent me after that night. Not one asked about your health, your schooling, your happiness. Each one asked for money. Every single one. I left them in the care of Mr. Bradford should they ever try to claim otherwise." Gasps filled the room. Edward nodded slowly, confirming the truth with his steady eyes. Linda's face went pale. Robert gripped the arm of his chair so tightly I thought it might break.
I swallowed hard, continuing. Do not let them twist words or wear the mask of family. Family is not who gives you life. Family is who gives you love. And David, you gave me purpose. You gave me joy. You gave me the chance to be a mother when life denied me the chance to bear one. That is why everything I own is yours. The room was silent except for the sound of the letter trembling in my hands. I felt the tears sting, but I forced myself to keep reading because I could feel there was more. But this letter is not just to shield you. It is also to prepare you. There is one more truth you must know, David. Something I could never tell you while I was alive. Something about your father. The words blurred for a moment as my breath caught in my throat. I looked up slowly, my eyes locking on Robert. His expression shifted, anger, then unease, then something that almost looked like fear. If Mr. Bradford is reading this letter to you, he will also hand you the enclosed document. Read it carefully. It concerns Robert Miller and the choices he made long before he left you. Bradford, calm as ever, slid a smaller folded paper across the table toward me. The envelope bore Robert's name. Robert's face drained of color. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice strained. I didn't answer. My fingers brushed over the seal, the weight of Margaret's words pressing into me. I looked up at my father and said quietly, "I guess we're about to find out."
The envelope was thin, but it felt heavier than a stone when I held it. Everyone at the table leaned forward as I broke the seal. Inside were 3 folded pages, crisp but yellowed at the edges. I unfolded the first. It wasn't Margaret's handwriting. It was official, typed, stamped, and signed. Robert Miller, I read aloud, my voice steady, was investigated 21 years ago for financial fraud and embezzlement tied to a failed real estate venture. Robert's face went red instantly. "That's a lie," he snapped, half rising from his chair. But Bradford raised his hand calmly. "Mr. Miller, please. These are court records. Margaret requested they be preserved for this very occasion." I looked down again, forcing myself to continue. Margaret Fairchild personally covered the debt to prevent her sister's family from collapsing. She paid every cent owed. In exchange, Robert Miller signed away all claims to the Fairchild estate, present or future. The second page bore his signature, bold and unmistakable, right beside a notary seal. The silence was suffocating. I could hear Linda's shallow breaths, her hands clutched tightly together as though she could will this moment out of existence. The third page, that one cut deepest of all. It was a letter. Not from Margaret, from my father. I read quietly at first, then louder so the room could not mistake a single word. "I never asked to be part of this family. The Fairchild name has always been a burden, a leash around my neck. If signing away my rights means freedom, then so be it. I don't need the boy. I don't need the estate. I need out." I froze, the words searing into me. I don't need the boy. My chest tightened. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. Margaret had tried to shield me from this truth my entire life. She hadn't wanted me to know how cheaply I had been discarded. I lifted my eyes slowly, locking on Robert. "You didn't just leave me. You sold me off. For debt. For your own pride." Robert slammed his fist on the table so hard the glasses rattled.
"You think you know everything?" he roared. "You think some piece of paper tells the whole story? You wouldn't have survived 1 year under my roof." Linda grabbed his arm, frantically whispering, "Robert, stop!" But he pulled free, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You may have her name, David, but you'll never erase mine from your blood. Don't you forget that." The room was frozen. Bradford's eyes narrowed behind his glasses. Edward shifted forward in his chair as though ready to step in. And I stayed still, because anger wasn't my weapon. The truth was. I pushed the documents back across the table, letting the sound of paper sliding on polished wood cut through Robert's shouting. I looked at him calmly and said, "Then let everyone here decide who deserves the Fairchild legacy, you who sold it or me who lived it." Robert's words still lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. My hands rested flat on the table, steady, while his shook with rage. "You think you've won because of a few old papers?" he spat. "This is blood, David. Blood doesn't vanish with signatures." Bradford leaned back, his expression calm but resolute. "On the contrary, Mr. Miller, the law is clear. You relinquished your rights long ago. What we're dealing with here isn't blood. It's binding legal precedent." Robert lunged forward, snatching at the papers as though he could tear them apart and erase the truth. Edward was faster. With one firm hand, he pressed the documents back down onto the table. "Don't even try," Edward warned, his voice low, his eyes fixed on Robert. For the first time, Robert seemed smaller. A man used to intimidation, now finding no one left to intimidate. Then Linda spoke. Her voice trembled at first, but it carried the weight of years unsaid. "David," she looked at me, her eyes glossy, her face pale. "I never wanted this. I never wanted you to feel unwanted. I thought it was easier. I thought Margaret would do the work you couldn't." And I cut her off, gently but firmly. "You thought it was easier. You thought Margaret would do the work you couldn't. And you were right. She raised me. She gave me everything you wouldn't." Robert's jaw clenched. "Don't listen to him, Linda. He's manipulating you. He's always been weak." I met her eyes, ignoring his voice. "You've got a choice now. Him or the truth, because you can't stand in both shadows anymore." The room was so silent, I could hear the faint tick of the clock on the wall. Linda's hands trembled as she twisted the ring on her finger, her breathing shallow. For the first time, she looked less like a woman rehearsing excuses and more like someone standing at the edge of a cliff. Robert barked, desperate now. "Tell them, Linda! Tell them this doesn't change anything!" Her lips parted, but no words came. She looked from him to me, then down at the paper still lying between us. And I knew, whatever she said next would seal everything. Her past, her future, mine. Linda drew a sharp breath, lifted her eyes, and whispered, "Robert, I can't lie for you anymore." The words hung in the air like a verdict. "Robert, I can't lie for you anymore." For a moment, the room was utterly still. Robert's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His face, once red with fury, turned ashen. You're choosing him?" he stammered, his voice breaking. "After everything, after all these years, you side with him?" Linda's hands trembled, but she lifted her chin. "I'm not siding with anyone. I'm telling the truth. You signed those papers. You walked away, and I followed you. I was weak. But don't you dare pretend this is David's fault." Robert slammed his fist on the table again, but the sound no longer carried power. It carried desperation. "You think this ends here?" His voice cracked. "You think some lawyer and a stack of papers erase me? I built my life without you, David. I don't need this family. I don't need—" His words faltered as his eyes scanned the room. No one met his gaze. Not Bradford, not Edward, not Linda. He was alone. "You were never a father to me," I said quietly, "and Margaret knew it. That's why she made sure you couldn't touch a single piece of her legacy." Robert's body seemed to shrink as the truth pressed down on him. The man who had walked in with bluster and entitlement now looked small, beaten, and out of place. He shoved back his chair violently, the legs scraping against the hardwood. For a moment, I thought he might come at me, but instead he staggered toward the door. His voice, ragged and broken, trailed behind him. "You'll regret this, David. You'll regret turning your back on your own blood." The door slammed. The echo rattled through the hallways like the last gasp of a dying storm. Silence followed, a silence heavy, but no longer suffocating. Linda stayed seated, her shoulders slumped, her eyes glistening with tears she didn't bother to wipe away. She looked at me, not with the hunger Robert had shown, but something closer to shame. "David, I can't undo what I did. But if there's any part of you that can see me as more than the woman who left you, I want to try. I want to make it right." I didn't answer. Not yet. Because forgiveness isn't given in a single moment. It's weighed, tested, and earned. Bradford gathered the papers calmly, stacking them with care. Then he looked at me with steady eyes. "There is one last instruction from Margaret." Bradford placed a small sealed box on the table. "She wanted you to open this only after everything else had been settled." The box was small, wooden, polished smooth from years of care, with Margaret's initials carved faintly on the lid. M.F. Bradford slid it toward me and leaned back. "Her last request was that you open this only once the truth had been spoken and the papers signed." My hands hesitated before lifting the lid. Inside lay a single photograph, worn at the edges, of Margaret holding me as a boy of 15, on the very day my parents left. Her arms wrapped around me tightly, her face defiant, mine buried against her shoulder. On the back, in her handwriting, were 5 words. "You were never alone, David." Beneath the photograph rested a folded piece of fabric. My old baseball cap, the one I thought I'd lost that same summer. She had kept it. All these years, a reminder of the boy I was and the man she believed I could become. The room blurred through my tears. For the first time since the reading began, I let my shoulders drop. I wasn't just an heir to an estate. I was an heir to love, to sacrifice, to resilience. Across the table, Linda's voice broke the silence. She loved you more than anything. I can see that now. More than I ever did. And I don't deserve it, but if you'll let me, I want to be part of whatever comes next. Her words hung between us, fragile and uncertain. I looked at her, not with anger, not with forgiveness, but with the calm of a man who no longer needed either to define him. Edward rose slowly, placing a steady hand on my shoulder. Your aunt would be proud, David. Not because you inherited land or money, but because you stood tall in the truth. I closed the box gently, holding the photograph against my chest. The fight was over. The legacy was safe. As I stood and walked toward the tall windows of the Fairchild estate, the morning light broke through the clouds, spilling across the polished floor. For the first time, the house didn't feel heavy with memory. It felt alive, with promise. I whispered into the quiet, almost to Margaret herself. I'll protect what you gave me. Not just the estate, but the strength to never be alone again. And with that, the silence wasn't painful anymore. It was peace.